Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let's begin with prayer. God, thank you for this season of Epiphany when you manifested your glory to the world. May we continue to manifest your love and your light in our own lives to a world that often is dark and in trouble. May we be sources of hope and light to other people as we manifest your love that you showed to us. We ask this through Christ our Lord. In his name, amen. Yes, we're in the season of Epiphany. The day of Epiphany was January 6th. Orthodox Christians celebrated that as Christmas. But in the Western Church, it's Epiphany Day, and this past Sunday was the first Sunday in Epiphany that typically in many traditions celebrates the baptism of Jesus. Well, we have three simple psalms, short. Second shortest psalm in the Psalter, I think, is a part of it. And we'll look at Psalms 129, 130, and 131. So Psalm 129, again, remember that these are a part of a collection in the Psalter called the Songs of Ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, Songs of Ascent, that were sung by pilgrims as they made their way on pilgrimage from the towns and villages of Israel, probably mostly in Judah, especially after the exile, to Jerusalem for key festivals. And these were memorized. They didn't have books that they carried with them, but these were psalms of pilgrimage that were memorized that come from different times in the history of Israel, from out of Israel's experience over time. And this first one, Psalm 129, remembers the suffering of God's people in the past and calls on God to continue to set the people free in the present from other enemies. I think the situation fits best the return from exile, when the Jewish people remembered that they had suffered greatly. And of course, the next psalm confesses their own responsibility for a portion of their suffering. But this psalm recognizes that they had suffered long in the past, and also then seems to indicate that current opponents are causing problems for the people and asking God to deal with that in a certain way. So we'll see that as we go through. Often they have attacked me from my youth, let Israel now say. Often they have attacked me from my youth. That opening verse and the first half of the next verse, using the technique of repetition for intensification, for emphasis, for raising the level of memory, to say that often in the past Israel has suffered from enemies. From my youth may refer to uh, the time of the Exodus from Egypt, from the beginning of the people as a nation. Uh, the me and the my uh, connote a separate speaker, doesn't it? But when he says, let Israel now say, he is clearly speaking on behalf of the whole people of God, to whom he is speaking. So often they have attacked me from my youth. Let the whole people say. Often they have attacked me from my youth, yet they have not prevailed against me. There's that tone of uh, defiance, there's that tone of strength, there's that tone of remembrance that God has delivered the people and they have prevailed despite the suffering that they have gone through. There's a lot of realism here in this psalm and acknowledged pain and suffering. I want to bring a quote from Craig Broyles about that in a minute. The agricultural image is introduced in the idea that the land of Israel, the land itself, has been plowed in suffering, just like the scars that may be left on the back of a person who's been whipped. They have plowed my back, the psalmist says. Again, speaking about the suffering of the whole people, but using an image from an individual who has been whipped and on their back has been left these bloody, scarry tracks of the whip and the embedded metal in the tips of these whips that ripped off flesh. It's a violent image, and it's intended to be violent by the writer, who is reminding people of the intensity of the suffering that they have gone through. But they have not prevailed. The enemy has not prevailed despite the suffering that they have caused the people over a long period of time. And why have they not prevailed? Verse 4, because the Lord is righteous. Again, keep in mind that the term righteous in the Psalms, particularly in the Psalms, though elsewhere in the Bible as a whole, the term righteous or righteousness refers to God's fierce determination to put all things right. Righteousness is not a static quality of holiness so much as it is a powerful active term of setting right that which is wrong. God's righteousness is fiercely determined to put all things right and to restore all things. And so the psalmist can say that despite the suffering that the people have had, God has proved God's self-righteous. He is the who has proved himself the one who will deliver his people and who has cut the cords of the wicked. These cords, of course, you know from your commentary, refer to the cords that were attached between the animal that pulled the plow and the plow itself. To cut those cords is to set the people free, and no more plowing of the land or plowing of the back, as it were, can happen when the Lord cuts and severs those cords. He doesn't kill the enemy, he doesn't destroy them as in some of the Psalms. He simply stops the process of suffering by setting the people free from those who are causing their suffering. The Lord has cut the cords of the wicked. Now, the last 4 verses of this psalm uh, consist of an imprecation, an extended imprecation, a curse, as it were, against the enemies. Now, up to this point, you could think that the suffering referred to in verses 1 and 2 and 3 was historical suffering, maybe even of the Exodus, but I think more likely the ripping of the people from the land into exile in Babylon in 586 BC. I think this is a post-exilic psalm, a psalm that was written after the exile when they returned in 532 BC. They look back. Yes, it's historical, but verses 5 and following seem as if they refer to present suffering. And we know from the historical books of the Old Testament and some of the prophets that when they returned to the land after almost 70 years of being gone for some of them, there were still people living in the land who did not want Israel to be reestablished and Jerusalem to be rebuilt and the temple to be reconstructed, even though the Jews had the permission of the Persian Empire, which had conquered the Babylonians in the meantime. and had given them permission to return to Jerusalem. And as they returned, they faced local opposition, enemies that did not want them to rebuild Zion, did not want them to rebuild Jerusalem. And so here it reads to me more like uh, an imprecation against current enemies, not just historical ones, but current ones. May all who hate in the present Israel, Jerusalem, Zion, may all who hate Zion be put to shame and turn backwards. He doesn't want them to be destroyed. He isn't asking that they suffer or be killed. He just wants them to be put to shame and to be stopped from what they are doing. He wants them to be the image now he uses, continues the agricultural image of plowing and land. Let them be like the grass that grows on the housetops. Yes, a layer of soil on the flat roofs, but it's exposed to the sun and the elements. And he says, let them be like that grass, not the grass in the field, but the grass on the housetops that withers even before it is fully grown. It dries out. Let the opponents, the enemies who oppose Jerusalem, be like that grass that withers before it grows up, so that no one who harvests it can fill their hands or their arms with sheaves of grass that are of some value. Let them be without value. Let them be useless. Again, this is a mild imprecation compared to some others in the Old Testament. He just wants the opponents to be of no use, not to avail in any way in their opposition against Jerusalem and the people of Israel as they have returned from exile. In fact, he says, may there not be anyone who passes by these enemies who says, may the Lord bless you. May the blessing of the Lord be upon you. Verse 8, while those who pass by do not say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you, which is what the normal blessing would be upon harvesters. So if you're obviously harvesting a bunch of dried weeds off your housetop, nobody's going to say, ah, bless you in your harvest. But you would when people were normally harvesting grapes or grain from the fields. So this is the end of the imprecation, while those who pass by do not say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you. Again, a rather mild imprecation. The last line of this psalm may not be a part of the ironic imprecation at the end. It might be something that the psalmist or the speaker of this psalm or a priest in the congregation says to the whole congregation, we bless you in the name of the Lord. Um, it could be a part of the imprecation, a part of the sort of ironic, may no one bless you or say, we bless you in the name of the Lord. But that last line could also be separate. As you may know, the punctuation and quotation marks and commas and so forth are not a part of the original text, and the translators of the Psalms, depending on the version you're using, again, I'm using the NRSV normally, uh, they put the quotation at the end of verse 8. I'm suggesting that it might be a line earlier, and that last line might be spoken by the priest who blesses the people who are on their pilgrimage and on their way, and may indeed have just arrived in Jerusalem. We bless you in the name of the Lord. All right, Psalm 130 now. Psalm 130. Psalm 130 is also a psalm, like 129, that recognizes pain and suffering as a part of the experience of human beings, a part of the experience of human beings as individuals and as nations or communities. Out of the depths I cry to you. Whenever that term depths is used, it's synonymous with the grave often. Sheol, the place of the dead, or at least a place of drowning, of being stuck in a miry bog, and having the waves of the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, or whatever lake that may have been a part of the writer's experience, wash over him while he is stuck and near to drowning. Out of the depths of problem, out of the depths of suffering, I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. There is an intensity in this opening that is a part of the anxiety and uh, concern, deep concern that the psalmist has. And out of that deep concern, he cries out to the Lord who is able to deliver him. Lord, hear my voice. This is where the hope comes, is that when the psalmist sees and experiences his depth of suffering, he has a place to turn. He turns to God. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications, using anthropomorphic language for God, as if God had ears to hear, and could hear the psalmist's voice like an ordinary person. It adds a note of um, personality to it, doesn't it? Of personness, of individuality, and thinking about God as able to interact with us on a personal basis. That's how the psalmist thought. Then he knows that a part of the suffering that he is experiencing, and this is not an element that was found in the previous psalm, a part of the suffering that he and his people have experienced has been caused by their own wrongdoings, by their own idolatry, by their own adultery, by their breaking of the Ten Commandments, of the covenant that God had established with Abraham and Moses. If you, God, should mark these wrongdoings, these sins or iniquities, if you should keep score of human wrongdoing and evil, why no one could stand before you. No one could be in your holy presence. Our wrongdoings have caused us to be alienated from God, the psalmist believes. And if God should keep score of them, keep track of all them, and hold them against us, there's no hope for us. But God is not like that. He says, verse 4, but with you, notice the strong adversative, which this verse 4 begins with. On the contrary, there is forgiveness with you, that you may be worshipped. Your translation may say feared or revered, or to be in awe of, that sense of the awesomeness of God. If we are to worship God, there must be forgiveness for the brokenness of human life, for the brokenness of our relationship with one another as fellow human beings, or in the brokenness of our relationship with God. If you should mark iniquities, count them, keep score of them, hold them against us, there would be no hope for us. Lord, who could stand? None of us could stand as human beings, not even the best of us. But with you, there is hope, and that hope is in your forgiveness. With you, there is forgiveness, so that you may be worshiped, so that there would be even the possibility of a relationship with God. And so the psalmist, knowing this, waits. That's a little unexpected for us, it seems to me. But his next move, after acknowledging his own brokenness and sinfulness and acknowledging God's forgiveness, his next move is waiting. That's a four-letter word. And I mean it in the sense that it's a four-letter word like an imprecation or a curse or a swear word. Because waiting is the last thing most of us want to do. But it's what the psalmist knows he must do. He must wait to hear that word of forgiveness. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. I have expressed my prayer to God. I have called out to God with the voice of my supplication. I have acknowledged my sinfulness and called upon God's forgiveness. And now I wait. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. And I wait in faith and in hope. In His word, I'm waiting for the Lord to speak His word of forgiveness. In His word, I have hope. Hope because with God there is forgiveness. So my soul waits for the Lord. Notice this repetition. Wait, wait, wait. 3 times wait is mentioned. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. My soul waits for the Lord. With what kind of attitude? Well, more than watchmen who watched through the night and are waiting for that first ray of sunrise to break across the horizon. More than watchmen who stayed up through the night and whose job it is to protect the city, to protect the people. And it's hard to do at night when you can't see whether the enemy is coming or not, and you don't know what the situation really is out there. But you're waiting for the light to come. We celebrate that coming of the light during the season of Epiphany, the coming of the light of Christ, who is the light of the world. But this watchman likens his soul to those who watch for the sunrise to happen, so that light might break forth, and it will be easier to know that we are safe and secure, because the dark night is over and the brightness of the morning has come. My soul waits for the Lord with that kind of ready expectation that watchers watch for the coming of the morning. He then turns from his own situation to the whole people, and that's very similar to the previous psalm, isn't it, where he said, let Israel now say, long have they attacked me from my youth. Even though he's talking about his own suffering, he calls on the people to remember their corporate national suffering. And now he calls upon the people of Israel as a whole to do what he has already done. That is to know that God is not keeping score of their national sins, but is a God who is ready to forgive them. Why? Because with the Lord, well, we heard previously, with the Lord there is forgiveness. Now he says, with the Lord there is steadfast love. So he calls upon the people to hope in God because of a characteristic of God that is at the heart of who God is, and that's God's steadfast love. And so you can wait in hope, both personally and community-wise, nationally, corporately. You can wait on the Lord because with God there is steadfast love for us, and God has the power to redeem a bad situation, to turn it around and restore it, and to reconcile people to one another and to God's self. With God there is steadfast love and the great power to redeem. In fact, one waits then with a strong sense of hope that it is God who will redeem the people as a whole from all their iniquities, not just individual sins, but thinking about the abandonment that the people of Israel um, did in breaking the covenant with Yahweh. And yet, even that national abandonment of the one who called them into being as a nation and watched over them in their history, nevertheless, it is he who will redeem Israel from all its iniquities, from all its sins, from all its failures. There is that kind of hope for complete forgiveness and redemption with God for us and for all the people. That's the perspective of Psalm 130. Psalm 131, the last of our three psalms or songs of ascent, as the people made their way, singing these songs, chanting them to one another as they made their way on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Psalm 131 may be the only psalm written by a woman in the Psalter. We don't know. Women may have been involved in the composition of other psalms. It's unlikely in a patriarchal culture, and we're not aware that women had roles as wisdom teachers and poets, though they did as prophets. Excuse me. Getting over a cold. You probably heard that in my voice. But Psalm 131 begins with a beautiful, humble expression of one's relationship with God. O Lord, my heart, the center and heart of who I am, my heart is not arrogant, is not haughty, is not lifted up. I don't have an arrogant heart. My eyes are not consumed with things that are above me, too high. My heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. There's a humility in the opening of this psalm, a kind of humble, humble admission that one is not claiming anything before God, just being there. Be still and know that I am God. That's that flavor of the opening here. I think this is not always the case with the psalmists. Sometimes the psalmists are boasting. Sometimes the psalmists are telling God that God is obligated to deal with their enemies or save them from their situation because they're such important people or good people or faithful people. That's not the tone here of the opening. This person is not claiming anything for herself. She's simply saying, I am a humble servant of God. I do not occupy myself with things that are too great or too marvelous. This person wants to remain in the background, my study Bible suggests, avoiding all pride, all anxious desire to please, all inappropriate ambition. But, verse 2, but, if verse 1 is about what I'm not doing, what I'm not like, verse 2, which begins again with an adversative, but what do I do? Well, I have calmed and quieted my soul. What does that look like? What does the calm and quiet soul look like? It looks like a weaned child on its mother's shoulder, on its mother's breast, a weaned child, a child who is fully satisfied. I think that's the image that we're supposed to see here. I have calmed and quieted my soul like a mother calms and quiets the anxieties of a young child who is now fully satisfied. The study Bible I use here suggests that this image of tranquility may be best suited to a recently nursing mother. But the point is, one's heart is not lifted up or eyes are not arrogant. The person is not trying to deal with things that are beyond their competence. They simply have calmed and rested and quieted their soul like a weaned child on the breast, the chest, the shoulder of the mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. Now that's the translation I'm reading from the NRSV at the end of verse 2. But there's a footnote that suggests that we might read it slightly differently. Instead of my soul is like the weaned child that is with me, the translation could just as well read, my soul within me is like a weaned child. Very similar thought, a little different expression. My soul within me is like a weaned child. So the person is talking about their spirit, their attitude, their thought, and they have this sense of peacefulness and composure. You might say that since God is like the mother, our soul takes its rest in God, who is like the mother who gives rest to the weaned child. Who is it that calms and quiets the soul? Well, the psalmist says that she does. I have calmed and quieted my soul. But that soul has this calmness and quietness because of the Lord. Israel, hope in the Lord. Why does the psalmist turn again from her own experience to the experience of the whole people? Just as in the previous two psalms, we move from the individual to the community. So here, this psalmist moves from her experience. This is a psalm of women's experience. From her experience to the experience of hoping in the Lord, who provides that sense of centeredness and peacefulness that is exemplified by this psalm. O Israel, hope in the Lord from now on and forevermore. 3 short psalms, each with its own spirituality, each with its own history of experience of both the individual psalmist and the nation or community of the people of God. May somewhere in these 3 psalms you find yourself as a part of the people whom God loves and forgives. Thanks be to God. We will go on with the next 3 psalms, the last of the 3 Psalms of Ascent, of the 15 Psalms of Ascent, next week in Psalms 132, 133, and 134. That ends this collection called the Songs of Ascent.